one of my favorite authors, William Zinsser, has got 4 key things to look at, communication or any form of presentations. The first one is clarity. Yes, and I like that because your message must be very clear. The second one, simplicity. The third one is brevity. And then the fourth is humanity. So these 4 are just very, very essential. If they can combine all these 4, they'll have a great speech. But it's not enough because that's what I call the framework. And it's part of the other 2 major components that I'd like to share. The first one is literally how you design, what are the building blocks of your story, or how you're going to present what you have to share with your audience. And that one, it's got a couple of things, and those building blocks are the following. First, your context, right? When you are in that context, you must make your talk relevant to that context, to that audience. And then the second one is literally what I call intent. Intent means literally the fact that you have something worth doing. But this is a static element. Yes, which means, let me give you an example. You want to be the best speaker in the world, and you've had the idea for the past 10 years. That's just an intent. It hasn't moved. Nothing is being put towards it to make it happen. Now the third one is what I call intention, which literally means the process of taking the intent and making it manifest. And then the next one is obviously attention. When you are presenting, when you are telling a story, when you are sharing something that's worth paying attention to, you must make people pay attention to it, which means literally paying attention, giving their time to it, giving everything else they're doing, and then coming to that point where, wow, this is really important. I think I need to pay attention. There's something of value to it, because the person who's telling the story, the person who's talking, the person who's presenting is making value visible. So wow, I can use this. It's exciting, it's entertaining, it's worthwhile. That's attention. And then the next one is what I call tension, which means literally the tension in the telling, in the story, and why it's so important, which means you move from one point to another one, taking the emotion of your audience from where they were to where you think they should be. And that's where the drama comes in. So usually there are many levels, but there are 3 movements in that tension. Something that it's going up, or can come down, or can just be there, not moving. It's in between up and down. But for the most part, you need a movement, you need a tension to take people's emotion. And that's what also the Greeks call drama. Yeah? Moving people's emotion. Either you make them cry, you make them laugh, you make them say, wow, this is interesting. And that's the parts of the tension that I like. That's a dramatic effect of your talk. And then the next one is literally the word humanity. And by humanity, it's very simple. That your story must be human-centric. Meaning what? And even if you're talking about a building or an architecture, a place of dwelling, you must connect that story or the telling to human beings. I mean, if you're talking about a building, it means that human beings live there. It's a home. There's life. Yeah. So when you make that connection, people feel that there's something breathing, living that's there. Let me give you another example. If you're telling the story about a poodle that just got killed on one side of the road, and then bloodied, sitting there, you're telling that story. Or you have a camera. You're moving that camera onto that dead dog with the blood. I mean, how do you make that human? How do you make that human-centric? Very simple. You just move your camera, or you're telling, on the other side of the road, showing a little girl sitting there doing what? Crying. You've shown the emotion, you've shown the human being on one side, but at the same time, you've already shown also the dead dog, which is a sad story, and you make that link between that death and that human. There's a link between them, between the dog and the little girl. You've made it human-centric. That's the part that I call humanity. And then the other one is what I call the promise. Every storytelling must come to a point where people ask themselves, all right, you've told that story, so what? What do we do with it? You know, what's the meaning for us that's worth doing something about? Or usually people call it also the call for action, which means I've heard the story, Koffi, then what? What do I do with it? Can it change my life? Can I refer back to it? Can I use it for something? What's the functional element to it? And I think that's a very, very powerful element, building block of your storytelling or your talk largely. And the last one, which I like most of the time, is your story must be memorable. In the sense that every story that is memorable is a point of reference for people, for anybody who listens to them or to it, to make use of it. Because if you didn't remember, if you didn't have a point of reference to go to and fetch it and bring it here and do something with it, then there's nothing else about the story. The story has no value whatsoever. So this is, in short, the big point in crafting the story. And so the other big element after having designed the story with all its building blocks is to look at the telling. But before we get to the telling, let's summarize a bit what we had talked about. The building blocks I talked about were context, intent, intention, attention, tension, which is a dramatic part with emotion, and then the humanity, the promise, and then a memorable story. Now that you know all these building blocks, the question is, how do I deliver them? And this is the part that becomes a lot more difficult, but also the most exciting one, where you have to use key issues of clarity, simplicity, brevity, and humanity again. So when you're now delivering, you put your story into shape, you've got the paper, and you've made it memorable, not just on the piece of paper, but even you yourself as a teller, as a storyteller, or as a talker, as a presenter, you now have to memorize that. You become a point of reference when you're telling the story. And people must remember you in the story. You become one with the story. And I think that's the power of playing out with all these components. So on that day or the moment of telling, of course, there are all psychological issues that come in. People can get nervous. People can think about, oh my goodness, how do I tell this story? What's most important? They can also forget. This is where memory management becomes really important. And that's one of the reasons it's good to rehearse first, regularly, to throw away the fear, the sort of uncomfortable position where you have the feeling that, gosh, this is not a great story. Why am I telling it? Everybody's looking at me. Forget about that. I think that's a very important point to remember. And then just tell it as you're telling to one person first. Yes. And as you tell it to one person, suddenly you start to feel like, you have something valuable. But the key for me is to going back again to that building block is to contextualize it enough, but keep the why you're telling the story, which means the intent part. Why are you telling that story? What do you want people to do with it, which is that promise? Bring a bit of humor. There are all kinds of little stories that you can bring to make people laugh, to make people think differently. But most important, get them to enjoy your presence. I think that's something that's important, your presence. And move about a little bit, not too much, not too many movement of hands that I'm doing, but also make it human, because you're human beings, so what you say must have some movement in it. Remember that tension I talked about? And then also a bit of drama, because people will connect with you if you're moving as a human being, but if you're standing, literally like a robot, it makes it a little bit harsh. Your story is static. You want a bit of movement in the story. But also your tone. I think this is another one. The tone, the pitch, And I know sometimes many of us worry about languages that are not our first languages. I think this is, in plain word, you shouldn't worry about it. It's a language, especially the English language. It's a powerful channel, a vehicle of expression that you should use. And just use it, say it. Even if it's in English that you don't think it's extraordinary, great, just use it, make people understand. The most important thing is to keep in mind the idea of clarity, simplicity, brevity, and humanity. And if you get all these set up, you're on your way to telling a great story that will be memorable, and then that'll last for a long time. That's on that note, that's what I think you should remember, if you can remember all the things I've said. But in large part, if you keep them in mind, your delivery will be a lot of fun. And don't be afraid of the audience. I know there's a great deal of talk about segmenting the audience. Do I know my audience? Who is in the audience? I know, you can do a detailed segmentation. It's never going to be great enough. Just think about, have a general view of the audience. I think that's the key. But also connect that idea of the audience to the reason why you're telling it, the story. And even if the audience is not the kind of audience that you're used to, and in fact it won't be, and your audience is not just the one that's just watching you on the stage, it's a much broader audience around the world, because this film is going to go all around. It's going to be streamed live everywhere around the world. But don't be afraid of just telling your story. The conventional wisdom, people are saying, just be you. It's a cliche, but I tell you, it's so true that when you forget about everything else and you just tell your story naturally, you are yourself there. There's nobody else. You have very little to add. But make the story, a powerful instrument that tells something that's worth paying attention to. And then you also become the vehicle to telling that story. So in short, again, 2 key points: designing your story and your talk. But remember that you have a context, an intent, an intention, and get their attention. Make it, if you want, create the tension or the drama in it, and then make it human being-like. Make human being focus, a story that's focused on human beings. And then give them a promise, something to hope for, something aspirational. And then the last one is the whole thing must be memorable. If you keep that in mind, you'll tell a great story.